There was no pulse. Both bodies were cold. Wow. Just think about hearing those words. Those were the chilling, strictly clinical words of Officer Valai from the San Diego Police Department. You know, on the morning of November 5th, 1989, the super quiet upscale Hillcrest neighborhood in San Diego was just completely shattered by a visceral crime scene at 1041 Cypress Street. What the police found in that upstairs master bedroom, well, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was the violent, shocking climax of literally one of the most notorious domestic disputes in American history. Welcome to this explainer on the anatomy of a true crime tragedy, the Betty Broderick case. Today, we're going to bypass the media circus, and we are diving into exactly what happened. We'll be impartially dissecting the raw evidence, the deeply fractured psychological profiles, and the massive precedent-setting legal fallout of a profoundly polarizing case. Here is our roadmap for today. We've got 1, the crime scene evidence, 2, a toxic, deadly divorce, 3, the psychological debate, 4, remembering the victims, and 5, the precedent-setting legal fallout. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the crime scene evidence. So picture this, it's about 7:30 a.m. and officers Valai and Cook pull up to the house. Almost immediately, 2 men, who turned out to be friends of the victims, are literally rushing out the front door, desperately begging for an ambulance. They direct the officers upstairs to the master bedroom. Right away, they spot a female victim on the bed and a male victim on the floor. Officer Valai steps in, checks the carotid arteries of both individuals, and nothing. Finding no pulse and noting that the bodies were already cold, the officers stop their search right there. They pivot to procedure, quickly sweep the rest of the house for threats, and lock the whole place down so Homicide Team 6 can do their job. Now, when Sergeant DeGelder and his homicide team actually start processing the scene, they spot signs of forced entry right at a south-facing window. And here's where it gets incredibly precise. They recovered exactly 4 bullets. Just 4. One had gone straight through a wall and landed outside on a landing. Another was lodged like 4 to 5 inches deep into a solid wooden nightstand. And the last 2? They were recovered directly underneath the bodies of the victims, Dan and Linda Broderick. It was a calculated, absolutely devastating scene. Which brings us to Section 2, a toxic, deadly divorce. To understand how we got to that bedroom, we really have to look at the staggering escalation of hostilities between these two over 6 years. On one side, you've got Dan Broderick. He's a prominent medical malpractice attorney. He's the president of the San Diego Bar Association. He basically knows the legal system inside and out. And according to the source literature, he absolutely used that knowledge to his advantage. He brilliantly maneuvered the divorce proceedings, using legal tools like Epstein credits to legally and financially penalize Betty. But then on the other side, you have Betty's retaliation. Extremely frustrated by her constant losses in court, her actions escalated to just wild extremes. We're talking physically driving her truck straight into Dan's front door and dropping their kids off at his house one by one, literally just leaving them on his doorstep. To put the financial battle into perspective, Betty was actually awarded $16,000 a month in alimony. I mean, that is a substantial chunk of change. But because Dan was just so legally adept, he managed to get the court to deduct severe financial fines from that exact amount as punishment for Betty's retaliatory behavior. So every time she left an abusive voicemail or violated a court order, she got fined. The court system itself basically morphed into a battlefield, with money being used as a very direct instrument of control. Moving on to Section 3, the psychological debate. Now, during the trials, mental health experts brought forward an absolute flurry of clinical claims. They explored whether Betty might be suffering from bipolar disorder, histrionic personality, narcissistic personality, borderline personality, or chronic depression. And look, it's absolutely vital to note here that we are presenting these strictly as clinical claims explored by experts in a courtroom setting, okay? Not as undeniable objective facts. But man, it really highlights just how fractured Betty's psychological profile had become in the eyes of the professionals who are evaluating her. It leaves us with this massive subjective divide found in all the source literature. Was Betty a battered victim, pushed to the absolute brink by severe emotional gaslighting and a completely rigged legal system? Or was she a calculating, narcissistic killer who just couldn't stomach the idea of losing her status and her husband? We're definitely not taking a stance here, but understanding this intense, polarized debate is absolutely essential if we want to grasp why this case still captures our collective attention today. All right, let's look at Section 4, Remembering the Victims. We really need to talk about Linda Kulkana, Dan's 28-year-old new wife.
in the media circus and even in some book portrayals later on, she was so often unfairly reduced to this one-dimensional stereotype. People cruelly dismissed her as just some teenaged office bimbo. And that narrative is tragic because it completely stripped away her humanity. It reduced a real person to a mere catalyst for Betty's rage.
But let's take a step back and look at how her loved ones actually remember her. Listen to this. She was attractive, yes, but she was also very funny. She had a wicked sense of humor. That is a quote from Spencer Busby, a close friend of both Linda and Dan. He described Linda as warm, funny, and deeply connected to Dan. Restoring this emotional core is so important, right? It reminds us that real people, people with friends, family, and entire futures ahead of them, were asleep in that bed when their lives were violently taken away. And honestly, we absolutely cannot forget the ultimate victims of this entire tragedy, the 4 Broderick children. Throughout this bitterly fought, years-long divorce, these kids were basically used as pawns in a vicious legal duel between their parents. They had to endure the trauma of a broken home, the psychological warfare between their mom and dad, and ultimately, the devastating, unfathomable reality of losing their father and stepmother to murder, and their mother to a life in prison.
Okay, finally, let's dive into Section 5, the precedent-setting legal fallout.
First, let's clearly define a critical legal term here, psychotherapist-patient privilege. Under the Evidence Code, this is basically a patient's right to refuse to disclose or prevent anyone else from disclosing confidential medical communications. Now, during the first trial, defense experts relied heavily on records from multiple doctors who had previously treated Betty. So what happened in the second trial? Well, the prosecution came out swinging and aggressively subpoenaed all of Betty's psychiatric records from those third-party doctors.
So this created a huge dilemma, and the crucial legal question became this. Does handing over these psychiatric records from third-party doctors violate Betty's Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination? At first, the trial court actually quashed the prosecution's subpoenas. They argued that turning over these medical records would impermissibly lighten the prosecution's burden and essentially force Betty to incriminate herself.
The defense fought fiercely for this, arguing that compelling the disclosure aided the prosecution. But the appellate court saw it completely differently. They ruled that the Fifth Amendment protects you from being compelled to testify against yourself. However, it does not protect voluntarily kept records held by third parties, like your doctors. Because Betty herself wasn't being forced to do anything, self-incrimination just didn't apply. This was a massive precedent-setting distinction. It essentially means that your Fifth Amendment rights might not actually protect the medical records your doctor holds about you.
So we've walked through the raw crime scene, the incredibly toxic divorce, the complex psychology, the tragic human cost, and that wild legal fallout. But looking at everything we've unpacked today, it really leaves us with one incredibly provocative thought. When the legal system itself is used as a weapon in a toxic divorce, who are the true victims? Is it the spouses, absolutely destroying each other? The new partners caught in the crossfire? Or is it the children left behind to inherit the wreckage? It's a heavy question, but it's one this tragedy absolutely forces us to consider, long after the gavel falls. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today.